Good morning.
Good morning.
Teaching and being taught spiritually must be understood from this basis, because this is the key to the entire situation. The natural man receiveth not the things of God. The natural man knoweth not the things of God, and indeed he cannot know them, because they are spiritually discerned. Therefore, they can never be known through or by the human mind, nor can they be taught by the human mind or through the human mind. And therefore, only an individual who has attained some measure of that mind that was in Christ Jesus, the ability to spiritually discern, can teach spiritually. And their teaching ultimates in lifting up the consciousness of the individual, or raising the Son of God in the individual, or developing that spiritual discernment in the student. Now, it is never what it appears to be, the imparting of knowledge, because, as we so well know, if you had all of the knowledge of truth that is in all of these books, you would still find yourself without spiritual power, unless in the study or reading of these books that spiritual discernment had been developed. Now, since spiritual truth is the very opposite of what you would call common sense, since spiritual truth is the very opposite of all that is intelligent in the human world, you can see that imparting spiritual wisdom is difficult, and if not clearly understood, becomes impossible. What must be understood? The first thing that must be understood is what you're trying to accomplish. And what you are trying to accomplish is to educate the human mind out of itself. Let us see what we mean by that. The human mind is formed of certain laws, theories, convictions that has been inherent in the human mind for generations upon generations, and which we inherit on birth. And one of these is good and evil. Now, every human mind is convinced of good and of evil. And as a general rule, it even decides what is good and what is evil. But to show you that actually it isn't making anything good or evil. The thing that is good in one place is evil in another, and the thing that is evil in one place can be good in another. The thing that is evil to one person can be good to another, and so forth. You may have a whole beautiful garden of roses, which to you are just magnificent. God's perfect image. And the next person comes along and gets sick from being in that garden with the roses. To you, animals, cats and dogs, may be just the most loving creatures of God. And the next person sneezes all day and all night in their presence and is made miserable. And so to one, the dog and the cat becomes evil, and to the other, it's good. And to one, the roses are magnificent, and to the other, they're to be avoided. Actually, you can go through the entire human scale of belief, summing up in your mind what in your environment is called good and what in your society is called evil. And then look upon some of the other societies in the world and see if they agree on that. And eventually you come to the realization that nothing is good or evil except thinking makes it so, except our acceptance or reaction to it. We probably would never want to get anywhere near the inside of a lion's cage, and yet the lion tamers go in there seemingly without any fear. There is a lady in Long Beach who has the most wonderful collection of reptiles in the world, and she's at home with them, and no one else dare go near them because they still have their poisonous fangs. But they do not disturb her. Oh, I could leave you safely for an hour or two to rehearse in your mind those things that you have automatically accepted as good, and those things that you have automatically accepted as evil, and then see if you cannot bring yourself to the realization how nonsensical. It depends on one's reaction. It depends on where one was born or how one was brought up. There are people fearing an invisible Satan. There are people fearing a church. There are loads of people in the world still fearing Hebrews and still fearing Catholics and still fearing whatnots. Therefore, of course, you know that in our strictly moral society, how many things there are that are shockingly bad, and that others have discovered to be not quite so bad. Therefore, the spiritual teacher must first of all have come to the consciousness that there is nothing out here, good or evil, in and of itself, regardless of appearances. It is the reaction to it that makes it so. And I will illustrate that in spiritual healing work. Someone asks for help for some illness or other. And the human mind, from the medical standpoint, this is evil. We must first give it, quickly give it this medicine, quickly give it this shot, quickly give it this application, so forth. But your spiritual practitioner, if they are to succeed in healing, must already have arisen at the state of consciousness which recognizes that nothing is evil. Only a reaction to it makes it so. Only a belief in it makes it so. As, for instance, this theory of catching cold by sitting in a draft or getting wet feet, which now is no longer a law, but which for so many generations was a law that brought about colds. Or the old days of menopause as having produced insanity. And now all of a sudden it doesn't. In other words, in those days, the spiritual practitioner would have said it doesn't. That nothing is evil, and nothing is a cause of evil, and nothing is an effect of evil, and would have healed it. But now it doesn't need healing because nobody accepts it as a cause, as evil. Do you see that? Menopause is accepted as a physiological change, and sometimes disturbing, sometimes creating a little nervousness, but not evil. And therefore, nobody fearing it, nobody is institutionalized because of it. Therefore, your spiritual teacher, to be a spiritual teacher, must have arrived, not at this knowledge having read it in books, must have arrived at the consciousness that enables it to sit down in the presence of these evil appearances, in the realization that nothing is evil. Only the human belief would accept it so, but that can't make it so. Well, when your spiritual teacher has arrived at that consciousness, then you know that teaching spiritually means bringing your student to that state of consciousness. It means not merely imparting some wisdom to them or knowledge, but through the imparting of this letter of truth, lifting them in consciousness to where they too can sit down in the presence of the lion and say, the lamb and the lion shall lie down together because they are both of the nature of God, and actually bring about that demonstration. And the way they bring it about is, they may not bring it about with lambs and lions out there, but you'd be surprised how many times they bring it about between husbands and wives, where the husband is a lion and the wife is a lamb, or vice versa. And where they do bring about the harmonious living together. Do you see? Now, the human mind, then, is actually a state of belief in two powers. And only as your spiritual teacher can, through these precepts and examples, educate the student out of this belief in two powers, does the human mind of the student relax and release itself and become receptive to the things of God, which, when they reveal themselves, usually say, "Fear not, I am with you." Well, in the same way then, the action of the human mind is to sit in judgment. And you cannot attain Christ consciousness until the human mind has relinquished that. Judge not. Judge righteous judgment. And therefore, as long as the human mind retains the desire, the will, the wish to judge. It is the human mind. It is not receptive to the things of God. Only when the human mind can relinquish judgment and say, Father, reveal this. Father, reveal the nature of this. Then, you see, the human mind is not sitting in judgment. It is not calling this good and this evil. It is not calling this moral and this immoral. It is not calling this honest and this dishonest. It is not calling this free and this slave. It is relinquishing. Eventually you must completely relinquish judgment. Who made me a judge over you? See? Who made me a judge over you? Neither do I condemn thee. Neither do I judge thee. Neither do I hold thee in bondage to my sense of right or wrong. You would be surprised what happens as even a measure of this takes place in consciousness. When that much of the human mind begins to disappear from you, that you are constantly looking out and enjoying the is, and not judging by appearances. Whatever it is that I am looking at, whoever it is that I am looking at, I am not saying good, I am not saying evil, I am saying is. What it is, or what thou art, I may not know. But I do know that it is, I do know that thou art. And then I will let the Father, spiritual discernment, reveal to me who thou art. And in the end it will say, knowest thou not, this is my beloved Son. But it will not only say that of Jesus the Christ. It will say that of the true identity of every individual, and of a partially attained Son of God in every seeker, who is really seeking and knowing what they're seeking. Now, the student does not know what they're seeking, and they have no way of knowing. And if they read it in a book, they wouldn't recognize it. It would not make sense to them. Not a bit of it. Only the teacher, who, and the student, of course, who is on the path, even though they have not yet attained, they do recognize, yes, that's what I'm seeking. Now I know how much further I have to go. No wonder Paul said, I have not fully attained. But at least I do know that, as far as I am concerned, I must relinquish this belief in two powers. Just as I must relinquish that there is a good and an evil anything, so I must relinquish that there is a good power and an evil power, or else I will be making the lifelong mistake of the churches. I will be seeking a God power to do something to evil. And they have never succeeded because there is no God power to do anything to evil. In the presence of God power, there is no evil. Now, there has been a change in language in these last few weeks in the message of the infinite way, in that I have more clearly perceived myself that we were too prone to merely say there is no evil, there is no sin, there is no death, there is no lack, there is no power in evil, when as a matter of fact this was only a half a truth. As long as we are in the three-dimensional mind, the human mind, there is lots of good and lots of evil. Just as there is light in the daytime and darkness at night. It is only in the presence of illumined consciousness that evil isn't evil. You cannot rightly say that disease has no power, but you can say that in the presence of the Christ consciousness, disease has no power. You cannot say that sin or false appetite has no power when the whole world is suffering from them. But you can say that in the presence of illumined consciousness, evil doesn't exist. So that as we now approach the idea of there is neither good nor evil, let us always add to that that last half of the sentence. In the presence of my consciousness, there is fulfillment. In thy presence is fulfillment. Not just there is fulfillment, in thy presence there is fulfillment. In my presence, in the presence of whatever state of illumination I have attained, is fulfillment. Not because of me, but because of the state of consciousness that realizes one power, the state of consciousness that realizes that out here, in effect, there is neither good nor evil. Then, finally, we come to the last stand of the human mind. This is its last-ditch fight. If you can master this, you are home. Until you master it, you are on the way. Or in proportion as you can master it, you are reaching home. And that is the law of self-preservation. The law that would compel us to save our lives at someone else's expense. The law that would say, let us throw the bomb first, because it'll save our lives. Or the law that even though the legal law says you may shoot a burglar in your home, but the consciousness that would say no. First place, I'm not holding that individual's life as less valuable than my property. And I'm not even holding it as even less valuable than mine. Because even as we have witnessed the Magdalene becoming the greatest of the Christ followers, how do we know what burglar may someday become another Christ? Therefore, we can't sit in judgment and say your life is worthless in comparison to mine. But it is not you, it is not I, who believe in this law of self-preservation. It is the human mind, the carnal mind, which is entirely built up of the word I. I, me, and mine constitutes the human world. I can do anything for me or for mine. Well, you can see that in proportion as you can relinquish this self-preservation, you would, while you are providing for the support of your family, you would also begin to see, oh, wait a minute, this isn't right unless I'm at least in a measure contributing to some other family that may temporarily not be in this. Or as you are providing for the education of your children, now this is not right unless I am also at least contributing in some way to my neighbors. In other words, the ultimate of this is love thy neighbor as thyself. Love thy neighbor as if thy neighbor were thyself. And then see that the human mind is not functioning, because the human mind could never feel that way. The human mind is interested only in me and my children, or it is only interested in me and my country, right or wrong. This is the human mind, right? But love thy neighbor as thyself and pray for thy enemies, this is the Christ mind. And now you can see why the human mind could never accept spiritual truth. Well, these are three aspects of the human mind out of which every student must be educated in some measure before there is enough of the Christ mind there to enable them to receive the things of God, to understand, to know the things of God. Because you can't know two things. You can't know I, me, and mine, and thou. So one must give way to the other. Then, in working with the letter of truth, the spiritual teacher must know that these are three aspects of the human mind out of which the student must be educated. But the teacher, first of all, must have themselves been educated out of those three phases of the human mind to some extent, so that they are themselves looking out without judgment. Without judgment doesn't mean without the ability to correct, because always, as we are presented with the human mind, we see its aspects, and we must correct the student. That is not sitting in judgment on them, correcting them. It is sitting in judgment on them to condemn them for it, or blame them for it, or hold them responsible for it. But to understand that each one of us is presenting aspects of the human mind, and that in teaching, our function as a teacher is to point these out and bring about ways of correcting them. So the teacher then brings out these three aspects and all of the illustrations that will help to dissolve the human mind. Now, heretofore, we have relied principally on the reading of books and attending of classes or hearing of tapes. And leading a student up to this point through these means is very well. and a necessary step. But out of all of the students who are studying in this manner, there will be found those who wish to go higher, who wish greater light, greater spiritual attainments. And then here is where we come to another phase of teaching, and one that comes down to us from the most ancient of days when there were wisdom schools, and this was the manner of teaching them. It is where a principle is given to the student for that student to practice and live with until realization dawns, so that they may say, on this point at least, whereas before I was blind, now I see. For instance, we have had given to us in these last few weeks the statement, "Thy grace is my sufficiency in all things, and there is a sufficiency of thy grace omnipresent for the need of this moment." Now this is a spiritual principle. It is a truth that is not true in the human picture, because to the human being God's grace is not a sufficiency, and nor is there a sufficiency of it present. Therefore it is only to the illumined consciousness that thy grace is my sufficiency, and that there is a sufficiency omnipresent. Therefore the teacher gives this principle to the student, and the student has to live with it and practice it until some measure of fruitage is evident from the abiding with that principle. Why? Because the measure of fruitage is the measure in which that degree of humanhood has been lost that needed something other than grace, or that felt that there wasn't a sufficiency at hand. Or this: as we understand charity and benevolence in the world today, we should embody these for the sake of the poor, for the sake of the downtrodden, for the sake of those who have not. But you see, this has made it very difficult for a sufficiency of charity and benevolence to go forth into the world, because it's so hard to make me come to the conclusion that I really should give up so much of my own, even for the poor and the downtrodden. Again, you see, there is the phase of the human mind that is clinging to itself and its own. But unfortunately, this time it is through miseducation, because that is not really the purpose of being charitable or benevolent. Actually, it has nothing to do with the poor or the downtrodden or the have-nots, because those, it says, you will have with you always. In other words, no matter what you do, you don't benefit them. You tide them over a bad period. the reason for benevolence and charity is that inasmuch as you have done it unto the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me, to myself. In other words, thou art myself, and I am thyself, and there is no such thing as thyself and myself. The self of me is God. Therefore the self of you must be God. And since there cannot be two gods, the same God that is the self of me is the self of you. And therefore, whatever it is that I do unto you, I am doing unto myself. Not unto you, and not for you, and not out of pity for you, not out of love for you, but out of love for myself, the one self, the Christ self, God. Therefore, I must embody this principle of oneself, and I must learn that this one self appears as infinite form. And just as I would feed myself 3 times a day, or just as I would educate myself, or just as I would do this or that for myself, clothe myself, or house myself, I must do this for myself in many forms. Because all are not awakened to their true identity, their self. And as long as they are in ignorance of their self, they will be poor. At some period or other, they will need help of one kind or another. But always, remember, I am doing it unto myself in many forms. Now, this is stated throughout the writings, but this is not teaching. Teaching is when you accept this as a principle and then start out to put it into practice until you have attained the consciousness, the actual feeling that I am thyself and thou art myself. It's a principle to be worked with. Now, this is how it was done in the ancient days, and that is why nobody went through class in a week or 2. Class took 7 years. And usually 7 years of living right in the household with the teacher, or right in the building with the teacher, so that not only the words of the teacher, but the consciousness of the teacher was being imparted. Well, that has become impractical because of worldly conditions. But the teaching on that basis could still go on with those students who were sufficiently dedicated as to be willing to take a principle, live with it, work with it, until they embody it. Now, in the same way, you will notice in our new papers and tapes that whereas our writings formerly said that eventually you must come to the place of rising above words and thoughts, in fact you must rise above the human mind, now these say that that must be accomplished now, not ultimately. And it doesn't mean that everyone who reads these writings will accomplish it or even will want to. It only means that to those with whom these statements register, that the time has come to reach the realm beyond words and thoughts beyond the human mind. Well, now just see. Regardless of what we have said this morning, up to this point, you can see that these words and thoughts would be meaningless unless you can embody them as consciousness. Therefore, the only use of these words and thoughts will be as reminders to you that you are rising above them to the consciousness of them. And that as you continue to remind yourself with words and thoughts that it's not the words and thoughts that are any power, but that the reminding is the lifting you above them into the consciousness of them. In the same way that as you approach healing work, well, let us take an absolutely impossible situation. I don't mean one that isn't happening every day, but I mean that one that seems impossible of solution. We have a call from a husband or wife of intolerable living conditions between them. Differences that just cannot be surmounted. And the appeal is to you for help. And of course, the first thought that has to enter your mind is, how can I enter somebody else's household and tell them what's right or wrong? And if I could, would they have the ability, whoever's wrong, would they have the ability to give it up? No. They are too convinced of their rightness. So therefore, nothing that I could think or do of a human nature would ever be of any value. Therefore, let me sit down and get at peace and see what is revealed to me within. And probably as you'd sit down, a thought would come like, well, of course, it's God's grace that meets every need, and that there is a sufficiency of God's grace. All right, then I'll just be still and listen. You're convinced that words and thoughts are of no power. You're convinced that no activity of the human mind is going to solve their problem. So therefore now you can listen. And even if you can only listen for 10 or 20 or 30 seconds, you've done that. You might have to do it 2 or 3 or 4 times in the day. You might have to do it tomorrow. You may get worse reports the day after. But nothing can change the fact that God's grace alone is the sufficiency, and that there is a sufficiency of God's grace now. Therefore, there can't be anything further to do than to sit down until God's grace is realized, because God's grace is not a term in the Bible. God's grace is an actual, it's an actual thing, it's an actual essence. There is an actual essence that could be called God's grace, a transcendental essence, something that you can't think, hear, taste, touch, or smell, but you can be aware of. That's the things of God that can only be known through spiritual discernment. Not through knowledge, not through the mind, but through spiritual discernment you can know that the transcendental presence is here, which is grace. Now, if that situation is to be met at all, it will be met that way. It may be met by restoring harmony between them, or it may be met by bringing about a separation. Because there is no law in any spiritual book that says any two people have to stay together. They may have come together for lots of human reasons other than that God brought them together. And if God didn't join them together, they can be put asunder. Because what God hath joined together, no man can put asunder. But let no one believe that all marriages have been arranged in heaven. And therefore, lots of marriages can be rendered asunder because God didn't form them to begin with. And therefore, the activity of the presence of the Christ can unify where there is love, or it can separate and divide where that is the way of demonstration. Therefore, we cannot sit in judgment as to whether our work was successful by the way it came out, except as what may ultimately reveal itself, as an illustration of what we had some years ago when a businessman owned a half interest in a business and wanted to sell it and asked for my help. And lots of people came to buy, and lots of deals came very close to being fixed, but in the end everyone fell through and nothing happened and the sale wasn't made. And finally the man was convinced that my work wasn't effective and he had me stop. And I guess it was a year later, he awakened one morning and said, "Why should I sell that? Why don't I buy my partner out?" And he did, and that has become his most successful business activity. He is happiest now than he's ever been. He's in a sense of completeness and fulfillment. And then he acknowledged, "Oh, I see. I couldn't ask you to sell my business, but to bring God into the situation, rightness into the situation, and it has come." Do you see that? So it is that we cannot sit in judgment, even if somebody is blind and said, "I would like to see, will you restore my sight?" You can't say yes. You can say, "I can't work for your sight. I can only work for the realization that God's grace is your sufficiency. And you will have to be satisfied with God's grace." "Oh, no, I want my sight." Well, then, you'll have to get somebody else. Do you see that? That's a very difficult thing to do. Very. It's difficult for me to write letters to people when they ask me to work for their supply and say, "I'm sorry, I don't know how." It's just something foreign to me. I can pray for you, realize God's grace for you, but I can't ask God to give you something when I'm already convinced that all that God hath, you already have, since I am the Father of one. Well, those who write and say, "Help me for supply," they must read my answer and say, "I think this man is sick." Do you see? And so it is, sometimes they write and ask me to sell property for them. I say, "Go to a real estate dealer." I'm not a real estate dealer. I cannot sell property for you. I can realize God's grace, but that may not sell your property. Now you see, the spiritual teacher cannot teach this unless they themselves have reached the state of consciousness that realizes this, and then they can only teach it in the degree that they know that they are educating the human mind out of itself, gradually getting the human mind to give up its reliance on its own powers of judgment, reliance on good and evil, reliance on money, reliance on princes and powers. And of course, along with that comes the realization that there's no God power to do anything to evil, and so they cannot even seek a God power. We can only abide in none power. But your teacher cannot teach that unless they first know, and then secondly, have in some measure attained. Now, you will discover for yourself that in the measure that your human mind yields up, that you are attaining powers of discernment. You are attaining the powers to know the things of God, to tabernacle with God, to commune with God, and never for a purpose other than the communion itself. Everything else is a grace which is added or comes forth from. All right, now we have two principles. Well, no, it's one principle. It's the principle of secrecy. You hear a lot about it in fraternal orders, but I don't know why you don't hear about it in religion when it is one of the Master's greatest principles. When you pray, pray not to be seen of men. Now here's one of the greatest principles ever revealed on the face of the earth. One of the greatest powers on earth is the power of secrecy. And here is how it functions. And this is why the spiritual teacher must teach it as a principle and see to it that the serious student works with it until they attain it. And here it is. I and my Father are one. And since I'm on the spiritual path, I'm looking to God alone for my experience, for my joys, for my successes, for my supply, for my happiness, for my home, for my health. I'm looking only to God for these. Now then, why should I make any of these your business? Why should I talk these over with you? Why should I tell you anything? Why should I bring you into my prayers? Do they have anything to do with you? No. They have only to do with me and my relationship to God. Therefore, unless I still think that I want something from you, I will stay away and go into the inner sanctuary of my own being, and I will tabernacle with God. Now remember this, there is no God in holy temples, there is no God in holy mountains. The kingdom of God is within you. So if you are serious that you really are going to God for your good, for your life eternal, for your harmony, for your fulfillment, because in the presence of God is fulfillment, then you must learn to pray secretly. You must learn to enter the sanctuary, the temple of your own being. You can do it in a church if you like. But most effective praying is done at home, or in the automobile, or out under a tree, where you're not conscious of other people around you, where there's no self-consciousness, where you can forget self and surroundings and get in there to the Father within. Now, I'm not going to God for anything. I'm going into the inner sanctuary of my own being to tabernacle with God, to commune with God, to realize my inner oneness with God. Because I know that I and the Father are one. I know that all the Father hath is mine. And I know that none of this is true in the human picture. I know it's only true if I can make the contact within. It only becomes true if, in my innermost being, I can make that contact and live with it. Then, Scripture says, what the Father seeth in secret, he rewardeth openly. What he seeth in secret is shouted from the housetops. But only in one way, by demonstration. The world may say, by looking at me, well, he's pretty happy. The world may say he's successful. The world may say he's joyous, or so forth and so on. But that is the way God proclaims it to the world. And I proclaim nothing further than that. Not the how or the why or the wherefore. That is my secret business. Until someone comes and says, share your bread with me. And I say, do you mean it? Inner bread, or are you looking for something outside? Whatever it is you have, I hunger for it. Good. I will teach. But again, it will only be between thou and me. This will be our secret. What I teach will not be the affairs of the outside world. And how I teach will not be the affairs of the outside world. And what you learn must not be the affairs of the outside world. This is your secret with God. Until there be someone. And so you see why it is that you can't even be a teacher until someone comes hungering for what you have. You can't be a healer until someone asks for what you have. Because you can't go out and tell this world they haven't got spiritual discernment. So if you could say, I have something to heal and I have something to teach, they wouldn't believe it. So you might as well be still until they come. Now, the principle is that in this secrecy and silence of my inner being, I and my Father become consciously one. The Father can announce itself to me. I can receive God. I can hear, feel, taste, touch, smell, whatever it may be aware of. And this is all I need. Because that which is taking place within me becomes tangible in the outer world as effect, as the fulfillment. In this presence of God within me is fulfillment out here. Oh, we're turning over to the other side to complete this.